The cellar door slammed shut like a coffin lid, and June Whitmore pressed her bleeding palms against the rough oak planks, her breath coming in ragged gasps that echoed off stone walls slick with October dampness. Darkness swallowed her whole, broken only by razor-thin slivers of dying light that leaked through gaps in the floorboards above. Her stomach twisted with hunger so fierce it felt like claws tearing at her ribs 3 days since her last real meal. Nothing but moldy bread and bitter water since then. Above boot heels clicked across hardwood with the measured precision of a funeral march. Ophelia's voice drifted down through the ceiling joists, humming, "Shall we gather at the river?" while something heavy scraped across the kitchen floor. The acrid smell of kerosene began seeping through the cracks, sharp enough to make June's eyes water. Her fingers found the fresh bruises circling her throat where Ophelia had grabbed her, dragged her down here for the crime of asking about the missing cattle. The bruises pulsed with each heartbeat, purple-black reminders of how quickly sanctuary had become prison, how completely her world had collapsed since the funeral. The humming stopped. Footsteps moved toward the window, and June heard the whisper of curtains being drawn tight. Then silence, the kind of silence that crawls under your skin and makes your bones ache with dread. She pressed her ear to the cellar door, straining to hear what new horror Ophelia was preparing. The scratch of a match, the whoosh of flames catching. And underneath it all, a sound that turned June's blood to ice water. The soft, satisfied laughter of a woman who knew she held all the cards. 4 months had passed since Samuel Whitmore's burial in Silverton's windswept cemetery, and the Colorado Territory's autumn had settled over the high country like a golden shroud. The aspen leaves blazed yellow against granite peaks, and the cattle had started their descent from summer pastures. But for June, this season's beauty felt hollow as a broken promise. At 19, she carried her father's stubborn jaw and her mother's dark eyes that had learned to watch shadows since Ophelia's arrival. The woman had swept into their lives 2 years prior, like a late-season blizzard, all silk dresses and calculated tears, claiming to be a Denver widow, seeking honest work as housekeeper. Samuel, still raw from his wife's death 5 years before, had proven easy prey for Ophelia's particular brand of manufactured helplessness. The wedding had been swift conducted in the ranch's front parlor, with only Pastor Mackenzie and a handful of neighbors as witnesses. June had stood in the corner watching her father's face transform with something that might have been relief, but felt more like surrender. Ophelia had worn blue silk that cost more than most ranchers saw in a season, though she claimed to have saved every penny for something special. Now, with winter approaching and Samuel cold in the ground, the ranch felt like foreign territory. Where June had once worked alongside her father, mending fences and tallying cattle, she now found herself trapped in endless domestic servitude, scrubbing floors until her knuckles bled, preparing elaborate meals that Ophelia barely touched, while June herself went hungry. In Silverton's general store, Ophelia played the grieving widow to perfection, dabbing at dry eyes with lace handkerchiefs, while speaking in whispers about June's difficult temperament and unnatural behavior. The townspeople would nod sympathetically, never noticing how Ophelia's tears never quite reached her calculating eyes. But behind closed doors, a different game unfolded. Letters addressed to June, condolences from distant relatives, business inquiries from neighboring ranchers vanished before reaching her hands. When June asked about them, Ophelia's face would crease with false concern. "No letters have come, dear. Perhaps the grief is affecting your memory." The isolation was surgical in its precision. June's friends from town found their visits discouraged, with subtle hints about family mourning and inappropriate influences. The ranch handsmen who had worked for Samuel for years were dismissed one by one for invented infractions. Each departure severed another connection to June's former life, another witness to who she had been before Ophelia's shadow fell across the valley. Only one creature remained constant midnight, a coal-black Mustang her father had given her 3 years prior. The horse had been wild once captured in the high country, and brought down half mad with fury and fear. But Samuel had seen intelligence in those dark eyes, a spirit that matched his daughter's, and he'd spent months gentling the animal with patience and grain. Midnight had become more than transportation. He was June's confessor, her guardian, her last link to the world before Ophelia. There had been a day early in Ophelia's campaign of starvation when June had collapsed, checking fence line in the south pasture. She'd lain in the tall grass, too weak to stand, watching hawks circle overhead and wondering if this was how she would die, not dramatically, but simply worn away like stone under relentless water. Midnight had found her there as shadows lengthened toward evening. The horse had nudged her with his velvet muzzle, then begun pawing the ground and calling out sharp, demanding sounds that carried across the valley like alarm bells. His cries had brought Elon running from the barn, a boy of 15 with sun-darkened skin and eyes too old for his young face. Elon was the last ranch hand Ophelia kept tolerated because his wages were small and his presence barely registered in her consciousness. Half Mexican, half Irish, an orphan, who had drifted onto the ranch the previous winter and earned his keep through sheer competence with horses and cattle. Samuel had taken a liking to the quiet boy, and Ophelia ignored him because he made no demands and asked no questions. It was Elon who had helped June back to the house that day, his strong young arm supporting her weight, while Midnight walked alongside like a guardian. And it was Elon who began leaving portions of his own meals where June could find them: cold biscuits wrapped in cloth strips of jerky tucked into feed sacks, dried apples pressed into her palm when Ophelia wasn't watching. Now, in the cellar's suffocating darkness, June thought of Midnight in his stall, probably sensing her distress the way he always did. The bond between them defied explanation, not supernatural, but something deeper than training or habit. They were both survivors, both prisoners of circumstances beyond their control. Above her, Ophelia's footsteps resumed their measured circuit from kitchen to parlor and back. The scrape of furniture being moved, the soft thud of objects being packed away. June could picture it clearly, her stepmother systematically erasing every trace of the Whitmore family, preparing for a departure that would leave no witnesses to inconvenient truths. Hoofbeats thundered into the yard, just as the sun touched the mountain peaks, and June's heart hammered against her ribs. Through the cellar's tiny window, she glimpsed boots and spurs, someone dismounting near the front steps with urgent haste. "Mrs. Whitmore, ma'am, sorry to trouble you, but I need to speak with you before I leave for Denver." June recognized Tom Brennan's voice immediately. He'd been one of Samuel's most trusted hands, until Ophelia dismissed him the week before, accusing him of stealing grain in front of the other men to maximize his humiliation. Ophelia's response dripped honey over poison. "Why, Tom? How thoughtful of you to stop by. I hope there are no hard feelings about our recent misunderstanding. A woman in my position must be careful about the help she keeps." "Yes, ma'am. I understand completely." Tom's voice carried carefully controlled tension. "I just wanted to make sure Miss June was doing all right. Her father was good to me, and I promised him I'd keep an eye on things." The pause stretched like a held breath. When Ophelia spoke again, her voice could have cut glass. "June is perfectly fine, thank you. She's simply adjusting to her new circumstances. Young people can be so dramatic about change, can't they? She's been having some behavioral difficulties. Nothing serious, just the kind of thing that requires a firm hand." "Behavioral difficulties." Tom's voice sharpened. "Ma'am, with respect, that doesn't sound like the June Whitmore I know. That girl's got more sense than half the grown men in this territory. Perhaps you didn't know her as well as you thought." The temperature in Ophelia's voice dropped to 20 degrees. "Now I really must insist that you respect our privacy. June is my responsibility, and I'll thank you not to interfere." June pressed against the cellar wall, desperate to hear every word. She could picture the scene: Tom standing in the yard with his hat in his hands, Ophelia on the porch, radiating false grief and real menace, the dying light painting everything the color of old blood. Ma'am, I'd feel better if I could just see June for myself. Just to know she's indisposed." The words cracked like a whip. "And I'll remind you, Mr. Brennan, that you're no longer employed here. You have no business on this property, and if you return, I'll contact the territorial marshal." Another pause, heavy with unspoken threats. June held her breath, hoping Tom would push harder, would demand answers that might crack Ophelia's facade. But when he spoke again, defeat weighted his words. "Yes, ma'am, I understand. I'll be at the Silver Dollar Hotel in Denver until week's end if anyone needs to reach me." Footsteps retreated across the yard, the wooden frame splintered suddenly, coming away from the stone sill in a shower of old nails and rotted wood. The opening was still barely large enough for her shoulders, but it was her only chance. June hauled herself up with strength born of pure desperation, ignoring the glass that sliced her arms as she squeezed through the narrow space. She dropped to the ground outside just as a third gunshot echoed across the yard. And when she looked up, the scene before her was like something from a nightmare. Ellen knelt in the dirt, his hand pressed to a wound in his shoulder, blood seeping between his fingers. Marshal Cameron lay crumpled against the kitchen door, a dark stain spreading across his shirt. And Ophelia stood over them both, with the marshal's own revolver in her steady grip. But it was the expression on Ophelia's face that made June's blood freeze, not the manufactured grief she'd grown accustomed to, but genuine satisfaction. The woman was enjoying this moment, savoring the culmination of her carefully laid plans. Poor Marshal Cameron. Ophelia said, her voice carrying clearly across the smoke-filled yard. He arrived just as June was attacking young Elan. When he tried to intervene, she turned on him with the same kitchen knife. Such a tragedy, a lawman killed trying to protect an innocent boy from a mad woman. Elan raised his head, his face pale but defiant. "Nobody's going to believe that story." Ophelia's laugh was like breaking glass. "Oh, but they will. Because I'm going to be the sole survivor, the traumatized widow who barely escaped with her life. The evidence will support my story perfectly, a disturbed young woman who killed 2 men and then burned down her own home in a fit of madness." She gestured toward the growing fires with the gun barrel. "The flames will destroy most of the physical evidence, but enough will remain to tell the story I want told. And I'll have enough money from the cattle sales to disappear anywhere I choose." June pressed herself against the foundation wall, her mind racing. She was still weak from days of imprisonment and starvation, facing a woman with a loaded weapon. But she was also the only person who could stop this madness, the only witness to Ophelia's crimes who was still alive and free. "There's just one problem with your plan," she heard Elaine say, his voice growing stronger despite his obvious pain. "Miss June ain't the kind to go quietly. She's her father's daughter, and Sam Whitmore never backed down from a fight. June is trapped in a cellar, slowly dying of smoke inhalation." Ophelia replied coldly. "By the time anyone finds her body, there won't be enough left to determine exactly how she died." But even as she spoke, her eyes were scanning the yard, some instinct warning her that something wasn't quite right. June knew she had only moments before Ophelia thought to check the cellar window to verify that her primary victim was still securely imprisoned. The pile of rocks near the foundation stones cleared from the pasture years ago lay within reach. June selected the largest one she could lift with one hand, its weight familiar from countless hours of ranch work. She'd helped her father build fences with rocks like this, had used them to reinforce creek banks and barn foundations. Now she was going to use one to save her life. She crept along the foundation wall, using the growing darkness and smoke as cover. Ophelia was still focused on Elan, the gun trained on him, while she continued spinning her web of lies for any future investigators who might question the scene. "The real tragedy," Ophelia was saying, "is that June could have avoided all this if she'd just been reasonable. If she'd accepted that some people are meant to serve while others are meant to rule. She ain't dead yet," Elan said quietly, and something in his tone made Ophelia's head snap up in alarm. "What did you say?" I said she ain't dead yet. Elon repeated louder this time. And knowing Miss June, she's probably got something to say about your plans. June stepped away from the wall, and then the stone heavy in her hand, and called out across the smoke-filled yard. He's right, Ophelia. I'm not dead yet. The woman spun toward June's voice, her face cycling through disbelief, fury, and something that might have been fear. Impossible. You're locked in the cellar. I was locked in the cellar, June corrected, raising the stone. But you never were as clever as you thought. The gun swung toward her, but June was already moving, using every ounce of strength and desperation she possessed. The stone left her hand in a perfect arc, spinning through the smoky air like a judgment from heaven. It struck Ophelia square in the chest, driving her backward with a sound like a tree branch snapping. The gun flew from her hand, discharging harmlessly into the air as she crashed to the ground. She lay there gasping, her carefully arranged widow's weeds torn and stained with dirt, her face a mask of pain and disbelief. June ran to where Marshal Cameron lay, her heart hammering as she knelt beside him. His eyes were closed, his breathing shallow but steady. The wound in his shoulder was bleeding freely, but it had missed his heart and lungs. Marshal. She shook his shoulder gently. Can you hear me? His eyes fluttered open, focusing on her with difficulty. June, how did you... The cellar... I got out. Ophelia shot you, but you're going to be all right. She hoped she was telling the truth. Help is coming. The sound of multiple horses approaching at a gallop confirmed her words. Through the smoke and flames, she could see riders, 4 of them, maybe 5, coming fast from the direction of town. Over here, she called out. We need help. The lead rider was Dr. Morrison, his medical bag already in hand as he dismounted. Behind him came Tom Brennan, returned from his trip to Denver, and 3 men June didn't recognize, probably townspeople who'd seen the smoke and come to investigate. Jesus Christ, Tom breathed as he took in the scene. Miss June, are you all right? I'm fine, but Marshal Cameron's been shot and Elon's hurt. She gestured toward the boy who was struggling to stand despite his wounded shoulder. Dr. Morrison was already examining the marshal, his hands steady despite his reputation for drinking. Bullet went clean through, he announced after a moment. Missed the vital organs. He'll live if we get him to town quickly. Tom helped Elon to his feet, supporting the boy's weight, while Dr. Morrison switched his attention to the shoulder wound. You're lucky, the doctor told Elon. Just a graze. Painful, but not serious. June looked around for Ophelia and found the woman still lying where she'd fallen. But her eyes were open now, filled with a malevolent intelligence that made June step backward instinctively. She killed my husband. Ophelia said, her voice weak, but carrying clearly in the smoke-filled air. June murdered Samuel, and then she tried to kill me when I discovered the truth. The lie was delivered with perfect timing, just as their rescuers were arriving and trying to make sense of the chaos. June felt a moment of panic. Would they believe Ophelia's story? But Tom stepped forward, his face grim with purpose. That's not true, and I can prove it. He reached into his coat and withdrew a thick envelope. I've been carrying this evidence for 3 days, waiting for the right moment to use it. Tom spread the contents of the envelope on the ground, where everyone could see bills of sale receipts, correspondence between Ophelia and cattle buyers in Denver. Each document told the same story: systematic theft of the Whitmore family's assets, conducted over a period of months, while Ophelia played the grieving widow. She's been selling off the herd piece by piece, Tom explained. I helped load cattle last week before she fired me to keep me quiet. These documents show at least 6 different sales, all conducted without June's knowledge or consent. Dr. Morrison looked up from his patient. These sales would have required the owner's signature. According to Samuel's will, June inherited the ranch and all its assets. Ophelia would have had no legal right to sell anything. Forgery, one of the townsmen said quietly. That's a hanging offense in this territory. Ophelia's face had gone pale, but she wasn't finished fighting. Those papers are fake. Tom Brennan was dismissed for theft. He's trying to frame me to cover his own crimes. But even as she spoke, June could see doubt creeping into the faces around them. The physical evidence was damning: the carefully arranged fires, the gun in her hand, when they'd arrived, the impossible story of a young woman overpowering a trained lawman. There's something else. Elan said, his voice stronger now that Dr. Morrison had bandaged his shoulder. She tried to poison Midnight Miss June's horse. Fed him moldy grain, hoping he'd sicken and die. That's not something you do by accident. As if summoned by his name, Midnight's whinny echoed across the yard. The horse was still in his stall, somehow having survived both the poison and the spreading fires. The sound was like a benediction, a promise that at least some things would endure. But it was what happened next that truly changed everything. Through the smoke and chaos, a new sound reached them, the thunder of hoofbeats, not approaching this time, but very close, moving with desperate urgency. Everyone turned toward the sound, just as 3 riders emerged from the haze, their horses lathered and exhausted from hard travel. The lead rider dismounted before his horse had fully stopped, and June's world tilted on its axis. The man was thin, almost gaunt, his hair gone gray, and his face lined with pain and exhaustion. But his eyes were the same warm brown she remembered from childhood, and his voice was the one that had sung her to sleep through 1,000 nights. June. Samuel Whitmore said, his voice rough with emotion. My brave, beautiful daughter. The silence that followed was broken only by the crackling of flames and Midnight's restless calling. June stared at the man she'd watched buried 4 months ago, her mind struggling to process what her eyes were seeing. Papa. The word came out as barely a whisper. He opened his arms, and she ran to him. Then crossing the yard in seconds and throwing herself against his chest with such force that his companions had to steady them both. He was thinner than she remembered, frailer, but he was real and warm and undeniably alive. I thought you were dead, she sobbed against his shirt. I watched them bury you. I know, sweetheart. I'm so sorry we had to deceive you. His arms tightened around her. But we had no choice. Ophelia had to believe she'd succeeded, had to think she was safe to reveal her full plan. Over June's shoulder, Samuel's eyes found Ophelia's face. The woman was staring at him with an expression of absolute horror, as if she were seeing a ghost risen from the grave. That's impossible, she whispered. I killed you myself. Arsenic in your coffee enough to stop your heart. You died in front of me. I collapsed in front of you. Samuel corrected gently. Dr. Harrison had been monitoring my condition ever since we discovered what you were doing. When the symptoms became severe enough, he arranged for a substitute, a vagrant who had died of natural causes, altered to match my general appearance. June pulled back to look at her father's face, her mind reeling. The funeral. Everyone in town. Closed casket, Samuel said. We couldn't risk telling you while Ophelia was still free. We needed her to believe she'd won to make her overconfident, so she'd expose her entire network. One of the men who had arrived with Samuel stepped forward, an elderly gentleman with a medical bag, and the bearing of someone accustomed to authority. I'm Dr. Harrison from Denver, he announced. I've been treating Mr. Whitmore for arsenic poisoning and coordinating this investigation with federal authorities. Tom stepped forward, understanding dawning in his face. That's why you dismissed me in the other hands. You needed Ophelia to think she had complete control. Samuel nodded. We had to let her believe she was winning, had to give her enough rope to hang herself. But we never imagined she'd become so violent in her desperation. His arms tightened around June again. When I heard about the fires, about her attempt on your life, nothing could have kept me away. Dr. Harrison was examining Marshall Cameron now, working alongside Dr. Morrison to stabilize the wounded lawman. He'll recover, he announced after a few moments. The bullet missed all vital organs, But it was the third man who had arrived with Samuel who drew June's attention now. He was younger than the others, with the weathered look of someone who spent his life in the saddle. And he wore a badge that caught the firelight. Federal Marshal William Hayes, he introduced himself. Mrs. Hartwell, or should I say, Miss Olivia Hartwell, you're under arrest for murder fraud and conspiracy to commit additional murders. Ophelia Olivia struggled to sit up despite her injuries. You can't prove any of this. Even if Samuel is alive, even if you have papers and photographs, it's all circumstantial. Actually, we can prove quite a lot. Marshal Hayes replied, producing a thick folder from his saddlebags. You see, you're not the first member of your organization we've captured. 3 weeks ago, we arrested your associate Marcus Sullivan in Santa Fe. He's been very helpful in explaining how your network operates. The name hit June like a physical blow. Marcus Sullivan. But that's impossible. He tried to steal our ranch when I was 12 years old. Indeed he did. Samuel said grimly. And that's when we first became aware of the criminal organization Olivia represents. Sullivan's attempt was our introduction to a network that has been victimizing ranch families across 3 territories. Dr. Harrison looked up from his patient. We've been tracking this organization for 5 years, building cases against dozens of associates. Olivia was one of the most successful operators, but she was never the leader we're truly after. June felt the world shifting around her once again. You mean there are others? More people like her? Many others. Marshal Hayes confirmed. Olivia specialized in the widow routine, marrying wealthy men, poisoning their wives, then eliminating the husbands when she'd gained their trust. But the network includes forgers, assassins, corrupt officials, and businessmen who fence stolen property. The implications were staggering. What June had thought was a personal vendetta by one twisted woman was actually part of a much larger criminal enterprise, a coordinated effort to steal the wealth of frontier families. But even as the scope of the conspiracy became clear, June noticed something that made her blood run cold. Olivia wasn't looking defeated anymore. Instead, there was a calculating intelligence in her eyes that suggested she wasn't finished fighting. You think you're so clever? Olivia said, her voice growing stronger. All of you so proud of your little conspiracy. But you've made one crucial mistake. She struggled to her feet, moving with obvious pain, but also with the determination of someone playing their final card. The mistake was thinking I'd come here alone. As if summoned by her words, new sounds reached them from multiple directions, hoofbeats moving fast, coming from the north and south simultaneously. Not rescue this time, but something that made Marshal Hayes curse and reach for his weapon. How many? Samuel asked, his arms still around June, but his voice taking on the hard edge of a man preparing for battle. Enough, Olivia replied, her smile returning. Did you really think a network that's been operating for 20 years would leave its most valuable asset unprotected? My associates have been watching this ranch for weeks, waiting to see how your little trap would play out. The hoofbeats were closer now, and June could make out individual riders, at least 6 of them, possibly more, converging on the ranch from multiple directions. They moved with the coordination of men who had worked together before, who knew their business and weren't afraid of a fight. Federal marshals. Hayes called out, his voice carrying across the smoky yard. You're surrounded. Throw down your weapons and surrender. The response came in the form of gunfire. Multiple rifles opening up from the darkness, muzzle flashes, winking like deadly stars. Everyone dove for cover as bullets whined overhead and splintered the ground around them. June found herself pressed against the foundation wall beside her father, her heart hammering as the reality of their situation hit home. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and trapped in the middle of burning buildings, with nowhere to run. The cellar, Samuel shouted over the gunfire. We can make a stand in the cellar. But even as he spoke, June could see the fatal flaw in that plan. The cellar was a stone box, with only one entrance, perfect for defense perhaps. but also a perfect trap if their attackers decided to wait them out or simply set the house on fire above them. "No," she said, surprising herself with the steadiness of her own voice. "We don't run. We don't hide. We end this here tonight once and for all." The gunfire intensified as Olivia's associates closed in from multiple directions, their muzzle flashes creating a deadly constellation in the smoky darkness. June pressed herself against the foundation stones, acutely aware that she was trapped between the growing inferno of the barn and an unknown number of armed killers who had no intention of leaving witnesses. Marshal Hayes had taken cover behind the water trough, returning fire with the methodical precision of an experienced lawman. Dr. Harrison crouched over Marshal Cameron's unconscious form, trying to shield his patient while staying low enough to avoid the bullets that whined overhead like angry hornets. "How many?" Samuel shouted, his own revolver in hand despite his weakened condition. "6, maybe 8. Hayes called back. "They've got us in a crossfire, but they're not professionals. Too eager wasting ammunition." As if to prove his point, a burst of gunfire shattered the kitchen windows above their heads, showering them with glass that glittered like diamonds in the firelight. June ducked lower, feeling fragments sting her neck and shoulders. Tom Brennan had found cover behind the wagon he'd loaded with salvaged tack, but his position was dangerously exposed to the riders approaching from the south. As June watched, he tried to make a run for better cover and stumbled, crying out as a bullet caught him in the leg. "Tom." June started to rise, but her father's hand pulled her back down. "You can't help him if you're dead," Samuel said grimly. "We need to think this through." But thinking was becoming increasingly difficult as the situation deteriorated around them. The barn was fully engulfed, now flames reaching 30 feet into the night sky and casting everything in hellish orange light. The heat was becoming unbearable, and sparks were beginning to land on the house roof. Worse, Olivia had somehow managed to crawl away, during the initial chaos disappearing into the smoke and confusion. June could hear her voice calling out to her associates, directing their attack with the authority of someone accustomed to command. "The girl is the priority." Olivia's voice carried clearly across the yard. "Take her alive if possible, but don't let her escape. The others are expendable." The words sent ice through June's veins. Even facing death, Olivia was still trying to control the situation, still believing she could somehow turn this disaster to her advantage. A new sound cut through the gunfire, Midnight's terrified screaming from inside the burning barn. The horse was trapped, probably overcome by smoke, facing the same horrible death that awaited them all if they couldn't break free of this trap. "I have to get him out," June said, starting to rise again. "Absolutely not." Samuel grabbed her arm. "It's suicide. The whole building's going to collapse any minute." But June could hear something else in Midnight's cries, not just terror, but rage. The horse was fighting, trying to break free of his stall, and that meant he was still strong enough to run if someone could reach him. "He saved my life once," she said, meeting her father's eyes. "I won't let him die in there." Before Samuel could stop her, June was moving using the smoke and chaos as cover while she worked her way toward the barn. The heat hit her like a physical wall as she got closer, and the smoke was so thick she could barely breathe. The barn doors were engulfed in flames, but there was a smaller entrance on the north side, a door used for cleaning stalls that might still be passable. June reached it just as another volley of gunfire erupted behind her bullets, striking the burning walls and sending sparks showering down around her. The door was hot to the touch, but not yet burning. June wrapped her hand in her skirt and pulled it open immediately, staggering backward as a wave of superheated air and smoke rolled out. Inside, she could see Midnight rearing in his stall, his eyes wild with terror, but his strength still intact. "Easy, boy," she called out, though her voice was barely audible over the roar of flames. "I'm here. I'm going to get you out." The stall door was latched, but not locked. June fought her way through the smoke-filled interior, her eyes streaming and her lungs burning with each breath. The heat was becoming unbearable. and she could hear the ominous creaking of support beams beginning to fail overhead. Midnight calmed slightly when he saw her, but he was still panicked, still fighting the lead rope that kept him tethered to the stall. June's fingers fumbled with the knots made clumsy by smoke and fear, while around them the barn continued its transformation into a funeral pyre. Finally, the rope came free. Midnight immediately bolted for the door, but instead of running away from the chaos outside, he stopped and turned back toward June, as if unwilling to leave her behind. "Go!" she shouted, pushing at his flank. "Get out of here!" But the horse seemed to understand something she didn't. As they emerged from the burning barn together, June saw that the situation in the yard had deteriorated even further. Marshal Hayes was down, clutching his arm and trying to reload his weapon one-handed. Dr. Harrison was pinned behind Marshal Cameron's body, unable to move without exposing himself to crossfire. And Olivia had reappeared this time, armed with a rifle she'd somehow acquired from one of her associates. She was using the kitchen door for cover, but her position gave her a clear shot at anyone trying to cross the yard. "Surrender now, and I might let some of you live." Olivia called out, her voice carrying the confidence of someone who believed victory was within reach. "Continue fighting, and you'll all burn with the buildings." It was then that June noticed something that made her heart race with desperate hope. The wind was shifting, carrying sparks and burning debris away from the house and toward the positions where Olivia's men had taken cover. The fire that was supposed to be their enemy might become their salvation. "Midnight," she whispered, running her hands along the horse's neck. "I need you to trust me one more time." The horse's ears pricked forward, as if he could understand not just her words, but her intent. June swung herself onto his back, foregoing saddle and bridle, trusting in the bond that had been forged through years of partnership. "What are you doing?" Samuel called out in alarm as he saw his daughter mounted and preparing to ride. "Ending this," June replied, and before anyone could stop her, she was moving. Midnight launched himself forward with the explosive power of a Mustang born wild, his hooves throwing up clods of earth as he charged directly toward Olivia's position. The woman's rifle swung toward them, but she was too startled by the audacity of the attack to aim properly. Her first shot went wide, the bullet whistling past June's ear, close enough to burn. The second shot never came, because Midnight had reached the kitchen door, and 1,600 pounds of terrified horse collided with Olivia's position like a living avalanche. The impact sent Olivia flying backward into the kitchen, her rifle spinning away into the darkness. She hit the wall hard enough to crack plaster, then slumped to the floor, momentarily stunned by the collision. But June's desperate gambit had accomplished more than just neutralizing Olivia. The sight of a young woman charging into battle on a burning horse had galvanized the defenders and demoralized the attackers. Marshal Hayes found new strength to return accurate fire, while Tom Brennan used the distraction to reach better cover despite his wounded leg. More importantly, the shifting wind was now carrying burning debris directly into the positions where Olivia's associates had established their crossfire. June could hear them shouting to each other, their coordinated attack dissolving into chaos as they struggled to avoid the falling sparks and burning brands. One of them broke cover entirely, running toward the creek with his clothes smoldering. Another tried to reposition but stumbled into Tom's line of fire and went down with a scream that cut through the night air. "They're breaking," Hayes shouted. "Keep the pressure on." But even as victory seemed within reach, June realized they weren't finished yet. Olivia was struggling back to her feet, her face a mask of blood and fury, and she was reaching for something concealed in her skirts, a derringer, small but deadly at close range. "Nigfurter." Samuel's warning came too late. Olivia had the little gun raised and aimed, her finger tightening on the trigger with the desperate strength of someone with nothing left to lose. The shot rang out across the yard, but it wasn't Olivia's derringer that fired. Marshal Hayes, despite his wounded arm, had managed one final perfect shot that sent Olivia spinning away from the kitchen door to crash into the burning debris that had begun to accumulate against the house. Her scream cut through the night as her dress caught fire, but it was quickly silenced as she collapsed, finally defeated by the flames she had started to consume others. The remaining attackers fled into the darkness as their leader's screams died away, their coordinated assault dissolving into panicked retreat. June slid down from Midnight's back, her legs barely able to support her weight, as the adrenaline that had carried her through the charge finally began to fade. The yard was a scene from hell. Burning buildings, casting everything in hellish orange light, wounded men scattered across the ground, and the acrid smell of gunpowder and smoke thick enough to choke. But they were alive, all of them, and the nightmare that had begun with June's imprisonment in the cellar was finally over. Dr. Harrison emerged from cover, immediately checking on the wounded. Marshal Cameron was stirring his eyes, focusing with difficulty as consciousness returned. Tom Brennan was pale from blood loss, but alert, his leg wound painful but not life-threatening. Samuel made his way across the yard to where June stood beside Midnight, his face etched with exhaustion, but alive with pride and relief. "That was the bravest thing I've ever seen," he said, pulling her into his arms. "And the most foolish had to be done." June replied, her voice hoarse from smoke inhalation. Someone had to break the stalemate. Federal Marshal Hayes approached them, cradling his wounded arm, but moving with the determined gait of a man finishing his job. "Is she dead?" he asked, nodding toward where Olivia had fallen. Dr. Harrison looked up from examining the body. "Barely alive, but she won't last long. The burns are too extensive." Hayes nodded grimly. "Probably for the best. What she knew about the organization died with her, but we've got enough evidence from the other arrests to roll up most of the network." As if aware she was being discussed, Olivia stirred among the burning debris, her eyes opening to focus on June with the last of her malevolent intelligence. "You think you've won?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. "You think this ends anything?" June knelt beside her, not from compassion, but from the need to hear whatever final poison the woman might spill. "It ends for you," June said quietly. "And that's enough." Olivia's laugh was a death rattle, but her eyes remained fixed on June's face. "The network spans 3 territories. Judges, marshals, businessmen, all bought and paid for." "We know," Hayes said, joining them. "Marcus Sullivan told us everything before we hanged him." Something flickered in Olivia's eyes, surprise perhaps, or simply the recognition that her final gambit had failed. "Then you know. This was never about money alone." "What do you mean?" June demanded. But Olivia's eyes were already glazing over, her breathing growing shallow and irregular. Whatever final secret she might have revealed died with her, as the flames finally claimed their last victim. In the silence that followed, June became aware of new sounds, hoofbeats approaching from town, voices calling out the organized response of a community that had seen the fires and come to help. The nightmare was truly over, but the questions Olivia had raised in her final moments would haunt June for years to come. Federal Marshal Hayes was already organizing the scene for the investigators who would follow, but he took a moment to speak privately with the Whitmore family. "This network was larger and more sophisticated than we initially realized," he said. "What happened here tonight was just one operation among dozens spread across the frontier. You've helped us deal a serious blow to their organization, but it's not over," Samuel finished. "There are others out there, other families at risk." Hayes nodded. "We'll continue the investigation, follow every lead, arrest everyone we can identify. But operations like this one are like cancer, cut out one tumor, and others may already be growing elsewhere." The thought that other families might face what the Whitmores had endured was sobering. But June found herself thinking of something else Olivia had said in her final moments. The woman had claimed this was never just about money, had hinted at some larger purpose that went beyond simple theft and murder. Marshall, June said slowly, when you interrogated Marcus Sullivan, did he say anything about why they targeted specific families? What made some ranches worth stealing while others were ignored? Hayes's expression grew thoughtful. Now that you mention it, there was a pattern. The families they targeted weren't just wealthy, they were influential. Politicians, military officers, territorial judges, successful businessmen. People whose disappearance or disgrace would leave power vacuums that could be filled by the network's allies. The implications were staggering. What June had thought was random criminal activity was actually a coordinated campaign to destabilize territorial government, to remove honest officials, and replace them with corrupt ones who could be controlled. It's a conspiracy to control the entire territorial system. She said, the pieces falling into place. They weren't just stealing money, they were stealing political power. And if that's true, Samuel added grimly, then what happened here tonight was just one battle in a much larger war. But before they could explore the implications further, the first of the townspeople arrived, Pastor Mackenzie, leading a group of volunteers with buckets and medical supplies, their faces painted with concern and determination. Samuel. The pastor called out, his voice filled with amazement. Dear God, we thought you were dead. The next few hours passed in a blur of explanations, medical treatment, and fire suppression. The barn was a total loss, but the house was saved, though it would need extensive repairs. The wounded were stabilized and prepared for transport to town, while statements were taken and evidence cataloged. Through it all, June found herself staying close to midnight, drawing comfort from the horse's steady presence. The animal bore burn marks on his coat where sparks had singed him, but he was alive, an unheard of miracle, considering what they'd both endured. Dawn came gray and grudging over the mountains, revealing the full extent of the devastation. The barn was nothing but charred timbers and ash, while the house stood blackened but intact, its windows shattered and walls scorched, but its basic structure sound. The yard was littered with the debris of battle-broken glass, spent cartridges, bloodstains dark against the dirt. June sat on the front steps, watching the sunrise midnight, grazing nearby with the casual indifference of a horse that had faced death and found it wanting. Her father sat beside her, his face haggard with exhaustion, but peaceful in a way she hadn't seen in years. How long have you been planning this? She asked. The fake death, the investigation, all of it. Samuel was quiet for a long moment, gathering his thoughts. We first suspected something was wrong about 6 months after Olivia arrived. Little things, medicine that made me sicker instead of better food that left me nauseated, moments when I felt dizzy or confused for no apparent reason. The arsenic. We didn't know what it was at first. But Dr. Harrison had seen similar symptoms in other cases, other families that had been targeted by this network. When he tested my hair and fingernails, the poison levels were unmistakable. June absorbed this, trying to reconcile it with her memories of that time. Why didn't you tell me? Because we needed Olivia to believe her plan was working. If you'd known I was being poisoned, you might have acted differently, said something that would have made her suspicious. Samuel's voice was heavy with regret. I know how much pain our deception caused you. I'm sorry for that. And Mama, where has she really been all these years? Samuel's face brightened slightly. At Dr. Harrison's clinic in Denver, recovering from her own poisoning and helping us build the case against the network. She wanted to come last night, but she's still not strong enough for that kind of journey. The news that her mother was truly alive, that the family could be whole again, should have filled June with joy. But she found herself thinking instead about the cost of their victory, the lives lost, the trust broken, the years of separation and suffering. Was it worth it? She asked. All the pain, all the lies, all the time we lost. Samuel considered the question seriously. If we'd acted sooner, more directly, Olivia would have simply disappeared and found other victims. The network would have continued operating, other families would have suffered what we did. By playing along with her game, by letting her think she was winning, we drew out not just her, but her associates. We've broken up an organization that might have operated for decades more. Dr. Harrison approached from where he'd been tending the wounded, his medical bag in hand, and his face showing the strain of a long night's work. "How are our patients?" Samuel asked. "Marshal Cameron will make a full recovery. The shoulder wound looks worse than it is. Tom Brennan's leg will heal clean, though he'll walk with a limp for a few weeks. Elan's shoulder is already mending. That boy's tougher than he looks." June felt a weight lift from her chest. "And Marshal Hayes, his arm will be stiff for a while, but he'll be back to work within the month. He's already talking about pursuing the other members of Olivia's network." Dr. Harrison's expression grew serious. "Which brings me to something important. The federal authorities want to offer you and your family protection while they complete their investigation. There may be other associates out there who view you as a threat." Samuel shook his head. "We appreciate the offer, but this is our home. We won't be driven away by the threat of criminals who are already on the run. Besides," June added, standing and brushing dust from her clothes, "we've proven we can take care of ourselves." Dr. Harrison smiled at that. "Indeed you have. But there's one more thing. Federal Marshal Hayes wants to offer you a position as a consultant on similar cases. Your insights into how these networks operate, your ability to see through their deceptions, could help protect other families." The offer was tempting, but June found herself looking around at the damaged ranch, at the work that would be needed to rebuild their lives. "I'm honored," she said finally, "but my place is here, helping to restore what was nearly destroyed. Maybe someday when things are more settled." Dr. Harrison nodded. "The offer will remain open. And speaking of restoration, there's someone in Denver who's very eager to see you both." 3 months later, June stood on the porch of the rebuilt ranch house, watching her mother tend the garden that had been replanted where the old barn once stood. Margaret Whitmore was still thin from her years of recovery, but her color was returning, and her movements had the determined energy of someone reclaiming her life. The house itself was larger than the original, built with modern conveniences and safety features that reflected hard-learned lessons. The new barn stood on higher ground, constructed with fire-resistant materials and multiple exits. The ranch bore scars from its ordeal, but they were scars of survival, not defeat. Samuel's health had improved steadily, though he would never fully recover from the damage the arsenic had done to his heart and kidneys. He tired easily and couldn't do the physical work he'd once managed, but his mind remained sharp and his judgment sound. He spent his days managing the ranch's business affairs, leaving the outdoor work to younger hands. Elan had grown into his role as foreman, his natural skill with horses and cattle, earning him respect throughout the territory. At 18, he carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone who had faced death and found his courage. The bullet scar on his shoulder was barely visible now, but it served as a reminder of the night when everything had changed. Tom Brennan worked as Elan's second-in-command, his slight limp the only outward sign of his wounds. He'd married Sarah Peterson from town the previous month, and they were building a small house on the eastern section of the ranch. Tom had never spoken directly about wanting to stay close to the family that had given him purpose, but his presence was a comfort to them all. The financial recovery had been more complex than the physical rebuilding. Tracking down the money from Olivia's cattle sales had required lawyers' court orders and months of negotiations with banks and buyers across 3 territories. Some funds were never recovered, lost in the maze of forged documents and false identities. But enough was retrieved to restore the ranch's solvency and fund its expansion. The legal proceedings had concluded the previous month with the conviction of 17 members of Olivia's network. Federal Marshal Hayes had been thorough in his investigation, following every lead and connection until the organization was completely dismantled. 3 territorial judges had been removed from office, a dozen clerks and minor officials arrested, and the entire corrupt system exposed to public scrutiny. But it was the personal resolution that mattered most to June. Standing on the porch in the afternoon light, watching her parents work together in easy harmony, she felt a deep sense of completion. The family that had been shattered by Olivia's greed and manipulation was whole again, stronger for having survived the test. A sound behind her made her turn. Alan was approaching across the yard, his work clothes dusty from a day spent mending fences in the high pasture. At 18, he had grown tall and lean, his face weathered by sun and wind, but still marked by the essential kindness that had made him risk everything to save her. "Evening, Miss June," he said, touching his hat brim in the polite gesture she'd never quite convinced him to abandon. "Just June," she corrected, as she had countless times before. "How did the fence work go?" "Good. Should keep the cattle from wandering into Thompson's corn." He paused, seeming to gather courage for something. "June, I was wondering. That is, I wanted to ask you something." She smiled, having suspected this moment would come. Over the past months, she'd noticed the way Ilan looked at her, when he thought she wasn't watching the extra care he took with his appearance, when they worked together, the small kindnesses that went beyond mere friendship. "What is it?" she asked gently. "Well, I know there's a difference in our stations, and I'm just a hired hand, but I've been thinking—" He stopped, frustrated by his own tongue-tied condition. "What I mean is, I've come to care for you deeply. More than I probably should, considering—" "Elan." June interrupted softly. "Are you asking if you can court me?" His face reddened, but he nodded. "Yes, ma'am. I know it might be presumptuous, but I had to try. You're the finest person I've ever known, and I'd be honored if you'd consider it." June looked at him for a long moment, at this young man who had stood by her family when it would have been safer to walk away, who had faced armed killers to protect her, who made her laugh and challenged her thinking, and shared her vision for the ranch's future. "There's something you should understand," she said finally. "If we're to be married, you can't remain just a hired hand. You'd need to become a partner in the ranch with a real stake in its success." Ilan's eyes widened. "June, I couldn't accept such generosity. I haven't earned—" "You saved my life," she interrupted. "You helped expose a murderer. You've worked harder than anyone to rebuild this place. If that isn't earning a partnership, I don't know what is." She stepped closer to him, close enough to see the hope and uncertainty warring in his eyes. "Besides, I'm not offering charity. I'm offering a business proposition. This ranch needs someone with your skills, and I need a partner I can trust completely. And if I accept—" He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Then you ask my father for permission to court his daughter like a proper gentleman should." Elan's smile was like sunrise after a long night. "Yes, ma'am. I think I can manage that." As they stood together on the porch, watching the sun set behind the mountains, June felt a profound sense of peace. The girl who had been broken by Olivia's cruelty was gone, replaced by a woman who had chosen her own path and found someone worthy to walk it with her. From inside the house came the sound of her parents' voices, discussing plans for the next day's work with comfortable familiarity. The ordinary rhythms of ranch life continued as they had for generations, as they would for generations to come. But there was one final surprise waiting, not in the years ahead, but in the immediate present. As June and Alan stood together watching the sunset, a rider appeared on the main road, approaching at a steady pace. As the figure drew closer, June recognized the uniform and bearing of a federal marshal. "Marshal Hayes," she called out as he dismounted. "This is unexpected." Hayes touched his hat brim politely. "Miss Whitmore, Mr. Whitmore. I hope I'm not intruding, but I have news I thought you'd want to hear immediately." Samuel and Margaret emerged from the house, alerted by the visitor's arrival. "What kind of news?" Samuel asked. "The best kind." Hayes replied, his weathered face creasing into a smile. "We've arrested the leader of the network, a man named Jonathan Blackwood, who's been operating out of San Francisco. We found evidence in his possession that clears up some remaining questions about the organization's true purpose." June felt her pulse quicken. What did you discover? Your instincts were correct. This wasn't just about stealing money or property. Blackwood and his associates were working to destabilize territorial governments, creating chaos that would allow them to install corrupt officials and eventually control entire regions. Hayes reached into his saddlebag and withdrew a thick folder. Blackwood kept meticulous records: names, dates, amounts, paid political positions, bought and sold. With this evidence, we'll be able to clean out corruption in territorial governments from California to Texas. The implications were staggering. The Whitmore family's ordeal had been part of something much larger, a coordinated attack on the very foundations of frontier society. How many families? Margaret asked quietly. At least 40 that we can document, probably twice that many we'll never know about. Families destroyed fortunes, stolen lives, lost all in service of Blackwood's vision of a criminal empire spanning the Western Territories. June felt a chill despite the warm evening air. And now it's over. Completely and finally over. Blackwood will hang his associates, are in custody or on the run, and the corruption they fostered is being rooted out by honest officials. Hayes's expression grew serious. What you and your family endured served a purpose beyond your own survival. You helped us destroy something that could have grown into a cancer on the entire frontier. Samuel nodded slowly. It was worth it then, all of it. More than worth it. Hayes confirmed. You've helped preserve the rule of law in territories where it was hanging by a thread. Future generations will live in a more honest, more just society because of what you sacrificed. As Marshal Hayes prepared to leave, he turned back to June with a final thought. The offer to consult on similar cases still stands. With Blackwood's organization destroyed, we're expecting other criminal networks to expand into the territory they controlled. Your experience could be invaluable. June looked around at the ranch that had been rebuilt, at the family that had been restored, at the young man who would soon become her partner in all things. The temptation to help other families avoid what they had endured was strong. But her place was here, helping to build rather than hunt monsters. I'm honored by the offer, she said finally. But my work is here. Building something good and lasting, something that can stand against whatever darkness might come. Hayes nodded approvingly. Building is harder than destroying, but it's the only way to create a better world. You've chosen well. After the marshal had ridden away, the family gathered on the porch to watch the stars emerge in the clear mountain sky. Midnight grazed peacefully in the nearby pasture, his coat showing the faint scars of his burns, but his spirit undiminished. He had become something of a legend in the territory, the horse that had charged through fire to save his owner, a living symbol of courage and loyalty. No regrets? Samuel asked, his arm around his wife's shoulders. None, June replied firmly. We lost years, we suffered, we nearly died. But we survived together and were stronger for it. Margaret squeezed her daughter's hand. And we have our whole future ahead of us. Marriage, children, grandchildren, all the life that Olivia tried to steal. As if summoned by mention of the future, Elin cleared his throat nervously. Mr. Whitmore, sir, I was wondering if I might have a word with you, privately. Samuel's eyes twinkled with understanding. Of course, son. Let's take a walk. June watched them disappear into the gathering darkness, knowing that when they returned, her life would be officially beginning a new chapter. The nightmare was truly over, the healing complete, and the future stretched ahead like an uncharted trail full of promise. In the distance, a coyote called to its mate, and another answered from across the valley. It was the sound of the wild country, dangerous and beautiful, where only the strong survived and the wise prospered. The Whitmore family had proven themselves both, and they would write their names large in the history of this harsh, magnificent land. The stars wheeled overhead, eternal and indifferent. But to June they looked like promises, promises of love and life and hope that no amount of human evil could extinguish. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities, new adventures. But tonight, surrounded by family, and planning for a future that included love and partnership, and the continuation of everything her father had built, June Whitmore was exactly where she belonged. The devil had come calling on the Whitmore ranch, but the devil had been sent away empty-handed. And in the silence that followed, broken only by the sound of wind in the aspens and the distant lowing of cattle peace, settled over the valley like a benediction.